So now it's been a little while since the greater good came out. I thought it was time to have a really good focused look at what we can get out of our tank aces. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our minutes on the tabletop. Now it's been a very good week for Guard, with the new rules from the greater good giving us a significant boost, not least because of the option to make some of our tank commanders tank aces. At the time we went through the rules and had a little bit of a think about what might be more obviously good. In this video we'll aim to try and really distill what's best and how I would actually use tank aces myself in a competitive Imperial Guard list. In this video we'll first have a quick think about how the stratagem works, when exactly you should deploy it, whether to give up your warlord trait for a second tank ace, and we'll go through each of the individual tank ace stratagems and try and weigh up the exact best use of the stratagem on the table. So without further ado, let's get into it. So tank aces are a rule that you can apply to your Leman Russes, Titanic vehicles, and you can also get support tank aces which can affect Wyverns, Basilisks, Manticores, Hydras and Death Strikes. There are two ways to get the rule into your army. First of all, and most simply, by using this tank ace stratagem that you can see on the screen now. You select any one Astra Militarum vehicle model from your army to be able to give them one of the traits, though if you do select something that isn't in one of the categories that I've already mentioned, there aren't any traits that will actually be able to be given to it. I'd note that you can't select it if you're Brood Brothers, so I'm afraid this won't be helpful for any Genestealer cults infested Guard regiments. But you should also note with this stratagem that you do it before the game begins, which means that you could potentially tailor which tank ace trait you take in your army after you've seen your opponent's list, much like you can with other pre-game stratagems, such as the choice to pick up certain relics that best help you out in certain matchups. With such powerful and diverse abilities, I think that this is absolutely key if you want to get another edge. For example, there's no point in building into your list one of the tank ace abilities with extra AP, and then you come up against a list that's entirely Chaos Demons, which all have invul saves, so your extra AP and therefore your tank ace stratagem is completely wasted. That's an extreme example, but it does go to show the point that some of these traits and abilities can be a lot more useful in some matchups than others. So that's my first tip. You can have a particular trait in mind, but you should tailor it towards your opponent's list, and definitely consider if any of the other abilities might be better for your given matchup. In terms of the power of the tank ace stratagem, I'd say that if you have a reasonable target for it in the game, such as Leman Russ tank commanders, basilisks or manticores, or perhaps a super heavy, then in my opinion it is certainly worth doing every single game. These abilities are incredibly powerful. A lot offer just flat buffs to your durability or damage output, and the vast majority of the traits are easily worth that one command point investment. Secondly, you have the option to include a tank ace instead of nominating a warlord trait from your Astra Militarum army. That model will essentially sort of become your warlord, so it does make it very easy to give up Slay the Warlord in missions that use that particular objective, which is the majority of them. Just because instead of being untargetable because of the character targeting rules, even if you push on a mighty Leman Russ battle tank, then that can easily get focused down by multiple enemy heavy weapons. And besides hiding out of line of sight, there really isn't much that you can do to stop your warlords going down. In general, people tend to include warlord traits on their army list, although some formats allow you to choose your warlord traits depending on the game. And if you're playing on one of those, you could decide whether or not it's better to have a warlord trait or to have a second tank ace. For things like Leman Russ upgrades, I'd say it's generally going to be more viable. If your opponent doesn't have a whole ton of heavy guns to reach out and destroy the Russes at the back of the field, it could well be a very safe bet for not giving up the Slay the Warlord if they're mainly slow moving troops that deal damage through melee, or don't have a ton of ranged anti-tank guns. Another consideration is that you could make your warlord tank ace one of the artillery options, such as a Manticore or a Basilisk. These guys could potentially loiter out of line of sight all game and keep the Slay the Warlord kill just as safe as it would have been otherwise. You do have to weigh this up against the powerful warlord traits that the Guard have to offer. In particular, Old Grudges is a massive buff to damage output against one enemy unit, and because this could affect a large part of your army, it's going to compete very well indeed versus taking a tank ace trait. Command point farming from Grand Strategist is also a very solid pick, so if you do make another tank a tank ace, it does have an opportunity cost. All that being said, let's actually take a look at the traits themselves. So we went over these briefly as part of the greater good review that I did last week, but we'll go through for a bit more of an in-depth look here. First of all, the Leman Russ tank aces have got 4 potentially useful ones and 2 that I would consider duds. First of all, Master Mechanic is -1 to damage against your tank ace. He can pretend that he's a Wave Serpent or has the Ironstone. He's just going to be a massive amount more of a pain to remove. The vast majority of weapons that efficiently remove Leman Russes tend to be multi-damage, and it depends on the amount of damage from the incoming fire as to how strong this trait is. Against damage 2 weapons, you're literally half the amount of damage your tank ace takes, effectively doubling his durability. Against damage D3 weapons, it will cut instant damage by a third, and it will be the same versus flat damage 3 weapons. It's not quite as strong against damage D6 weapons, but still certainly isn't bad, making your Russ about 24% tougher against that type of attack. Of course, this won't help you against mortal wounds and damage 1 weaponry at all, but usually mortal wounds struggle to get to Leman Russes at the back of an army, and damage 1 weapons don't tend to be very efficient at taking out Russes in the first place. So typically you're going to see a damage reduction of anywhere between 25 and 50%. This is the trait to put on your biggest, most threatening Russ, maybe a tricked out Demolisher tank commander thundering up the centre of the board, ready to deal massive damage with that Demolisher cannon, or perhaps a Russ with the Hammer of Sunderance, the relic from the Vigilist detachment, loitering at the back with the las cannons and plasma cannon sponsons for good measure. Basically this trait will make that one Russ an absolute pain to kill, particularly if you combine it with things like Psychic Barrier or Night Shroud, to further stack the defensive buffs. This one is super strong, one of the strongest tank ace abilities that we have. Next up we have a reasonable damage buff. This one is slow and purposeful, and when you move less than half your move, you reroll wound rolls of 1 for all of your tank's ranged attacks. Reroll wound rolls of 1 is essentially a 17% damage buff, provided you don't already have a source of it, such as say Old Grudges. The fact that you have to move slow is sometimes going to be an issue, particularly if you're scooting around to try and get a line of sight, but typically most Russes are going to want to move less than half speed because of grinding advance. Again, this is going to be the best on the biggest, nastiest tank commander with the most damage output. Hammers of Sunderance, Demolisher cannons, tanks tricked out with las cannons and plasma cannon sponsons, that sort of thing. Though you are painting a bit of a bullseye on that tank, making it absolutely clear to your opponent they want to be killing that one first. Next up we have Weapons Expert. This one increases your turret AP by -1. This is probably the single biggest improvement on the Punisher tank commander. For example, a Punisher tank commander rerolling 1s with this trait will kill an average of 5 Space Marine Intercessors, rather than just over 3 that it would have if it didn't have the extra AP. Having just 1 pip of AP really makes it a lot more of a versatile weapon, good at killing everything else. Even against lowly armoured orcs, this is a 20% damage increase on the turret, so on Punishers it certainly outperforms Weapon Expert, though of course you don't get the reroll 1s to wound on your secondary weapons. It's also strong on the autocannon Exterminators, low AP being one of that variant's main weaknesses, and it's also very strong on battle cannons and the Hammer of Sunderance. Going up to AP -3 makes them a lot more efficient against power armoured targets or your standard vehicle profile that has a 3-up save. On a Hammer of Sunderance Russ targeting another vehicle with a 3-up save and no invul, it'll be around about a 25% damage increase. Again, better than slow and purposeful on the turret, but of course it doesn't affect the secondary weapons. Overall, I think Slow and Purposeful and Weapon Expert are pretty well balanced. On battle cannon tanks, I tend to take Weapon Expert on Punishers, and I'd probably take Slow and Purposeful on Demolishers and Executioners due to them having such high AP, so getting a little bit more has less value. Next we have Armoured Rush, which frankly I just wouldn't take, I'm afraid. This one lets you shoot with your turret weapon if you're advanced. You won't get grinding advance, you won't get to fire the rest of your secondary weapon systems. Honestly, it's really not worth it compared with the other traits. You don't want to be randomly advancing your Russes. Next we have another good one though, which is Up Armoured. This is a nice plain simple one of giving your Russ a 2-up save. Absolutely great if you can combine this with Cover or Psychic Barrier to make it all but impervious to all but the heaviest firepower. As with Master Mechanic, this is going to be strongest on your most dangerous tanks that the opponent's most going to want to kill early. Things like a Russ with the Hammer of Sunderance, Leman Russ Demolishers, or any other tricked out tank commanders. The question you have to ask yourself is whether or not this is better than Master Mechanic, and that largely depends on the amount of AP that you're going to be facing. If the majority of the fire is AP -2, say you're facing off against a bunch of guard battle cannons or something, it's going to be around about a 33% durability increase. If it's mainly AP -3, it's more like 25%. And AP -4 is a lot worse, at just 17% reduction in damage. So if you are buying a tank ace ability in pre-game, you need to look at your opponent's list. If it has lots of damage 2 weapons in it, or damage D3 weapons, or lots of AP3 and AP -4 shooting, then Master Mechanic is generally going to be the way to go. But if it has a ton of low AP shooting and lots of damage D6 weapons, Up Armoured might be better. Up Armoured will tend to generally win out if you're able to get cover or combine it with Psychic Barrier though, which might depend on whether you get first turn and what the terrain is like. I honestly like them both, they're fairly well balanced, and I could happily take either. The last Leman Russ trait is a bit of a dud again, I'm afraid. Steel Commander lets you issue one additional tank order per turn. The reason that this isn't very impressive is that the best that this is going to amount to is reroll ones to hit for one of your regular Leman Russes, or maybe using Strike and Shroud to give them a firing and then -1 to hit. Both of these just aren't really going to compare with the opportunity cost that you could have had for getting one of the very powerful defensive or offensive buffs all game long, because you can put these powerful defensive or offensive buffs on the actual tank commander, which really is the tank that you want to be buffing, and realistically Steel Commander's only ever going to be used ordering other Rosses, because the tank commander themselves already have one order which they can use to order themselves. So honestly, I can't really see a situation in which I'd ever run Steel Commander compared with the main 4 Leman Russ traits that I like. So overall, they're all good, extra damage output or extra durability on your key Rosses, depending on exactly what you need for your list. Next up we come to the support tank aces. These can be used on Basilisks, Manticores, Wyverns, Hydras or Death Strikes. And here we have the options of 2 pretty decent damage buffs and 1 interesting leadership manipulation mechanic. First of all, we have full payload, which I'd argue is probably the best. This one allows you to automatically roll the highest roll you can on your damage roll for any ranged weapons that this unit uses, basically meaning that it's only relevant on the Manticore or Basilisk, and you'll essentially change their damage profile from damage D3 to flat damage 3. Of course, this is no use whatsoever against light infantry, but against heavy vehicles and armoured targets, you essentially just added an extra 50% to their damage output. It's very nice indeed. This is also particularly good against 3 wound infantry, where every single failed save will lead to a dead model, so it certainly increases their viability against things like aggressors. I'd say the single strongest way to run this would be in a Basilisk in the Vigilist detachment, the Emperor's Wrath Artillery Company, as you can stack other buffs on that same Basilisk. With the Relic you can get it to ignore cover, and with a Stratagem you can get it to fire this big flat damage 3 gun twice. You can also combine that with other codex options and stratagems, such as Cast Chance to try and make it get even more shots, or Cadian's reroll hit rolls of 1s, or maybe even their stratagem of overlapping fields. Say you did have a Cadian Basilisk firing twice with this gun, that will cost you 2 command points, but it will give you an average of 8 or 9 damage on any given toughness 7 or 8 vehicle with a 3-up save on the board. This really is absolute immense targeted firepower for the points cost, and being able to hit units that are hiding out of line of sight is great as well. Unlike the souped up Rosses, this guy doesn't have to expose himself, so he's a lot more likely to be safe out of line of sight, able to leverage his buff all game long. This certainly isn't bad on a Manticore either. He doesn't have the fire again strat from Vigilus, but he does have that new direct fire stratagem from the Greater Good, meaning that you could have him hitting on 3s for 1 command point while dishing out his 3 damage, provided he can see his target, that is. With a Basilisk or a Manticore, this is a really solid trait. Next we have the leadership option, which is Shatterer of Will. Basically, after you've shot with this unit, you can pick one of the units that it's shot at, and that unit will be -2 leadership. Now, leadership debuffs aren't always the best, but this one is very easy to apply indeed, and it genuinely could make damage output a thing via leadership, although as we know there are plenty of ways to mitigate or protect it, and some armies just don't care at all. It'd be quite fun to see a guard leadership breaking army with this guy run alongside some of those new Cyan Jackal, Militarum Tempestus Scions. You could easily be spooking some of your opponent's army off the board, or forcing them to pay through the nose in CP to keep them around. For me though, in a take-all-comers match, it's probably not going to outcompete the additional damage output of the other 2 traits, but it certainly could be fun to mess around with in a less optimised game. Finally, we have well-stocked magazines, which is reroll the number of shots when you are firing weapons with a random number of shots. So this can affect either the Basilisk, Manticore, Wyvern or Death Strike, and on average this leads to a roughly 20% increase in the eventual damage output from most of these units. It's a little bit less valuable on the Basilisk, due to that already having 2 dice and pick the highest when you're determining the number of shots. For me, this one isn't quite as overwhelming as the full payload one, although admittedly this will affect your damage output against all targets, not just heavy vehicles, so I guess there is that. It will equate to a few more hits per game if your artillery piece gets to keep on firing. With the Wyvern you can expect 1 or 2 extra hits on your target per turn, which isn't nothing, but it's not exactly overwhelming. With the Manticore it's more like 1, and same with the Death Strike, it's more like 1 mortal wound additional, compared with if you didn't have this benefit. So sadly still it isn't going to make the Death Strike work. In general, I don't think that this is quite as strong as full payload, but if you have no other good things to put tank ace on, it could perhaps be worth it for a wyvern to get a little bit of damage output out of it. After all, it is only 1 command points bonus, and if you are using a wyvern to double fire in that same visualist formation, it will likely pay for the investment over the course of the game. Opportunity cost is really the only thing that keeps me away from this one. Finally, we come to the super heavy aces. Inspiring Might is a leadership boost to nearby infantry. Honestly, it's not really worth it. Just pay for a couple more commissars if you're really that bothered about a few guardsmen running away. It's not worth wasting your tank ace ability and being forced to position your super heavy tank in a weird way. The other two are both potentially interesting though. First of all, we have hold down deployment, which will count your super heavy tank as being in cover until the first time that it moves. Against most armies, this will mean that you get a 2-up save against ranged attacks until you bother to move, and we've already discussed why that's a very good thing when we talked about the up armoured stratagem. It's particularly good as super heavy tanks can't usually get the benefit of prepared positions, so this is one way of pushing its durability up just like the rest of the army. Some armies do ignore cover, like Imperial fists, so obviously it's not worth buying in against them. Sometimes you're definitely going to need to move your super heavy tank if there's no good firing lanes available and the opponent's just going to be able to move out of line of sight and negate your whole investment. But in games when you can get a good firing position and just blaze away all game while gaining this benefit, it's very good. Just like up armoured for the regular Ross, this combos very nicely with Psychic Barrier, meaning that even AP3 weapons will still grant you a 4+ save. Certainly powerful and well worth 1 command point in the right matchup, just obviously don't buy it in against ignores cover armies or armies that are mainly all about melee damage. Finally, we have Steadfast Leviathan, which is one that you would probably have to plan to use pre-game as part of your army construction, as you buy it in when you have a super heavy auxiliary detachment for a Titanic unit, and this one basically allows you to use a regiment trait on it. Now, one of the main things for super heavy tanks is gaining access to the right stratagems, so that might be worth more to you than giving it any one individual regimental trait, particularly something like reroll 1s to hit when stationary in Cadia, maybe reroll the number of dice on the turret weapon from Kaschan, extra range from Vostroyan. Of course, they have a very nice stratagem as well for super heavies with +1 to hit, or you could potentially use the custom regiments, although that way you do forego having the unique regimental stratagem, making a custom regiment with the Kaschan rerolls for number of shots for a weapon, gunnery experts I believe it's called, and maybe spotter detail to get extra range on all of its shorter range guns, or perhaps even jury rigging to hopefully have 1 or more wounds come back each turn and have your tank regenerate. There are a lot of options here, and it depends on exactly what sort of super heavy you're going for. It'd be interesting to see how this combines with some of the Forge World super heavy tanks, which I must say I'm not as familiar with compared with the ones in the main codex. Overall, it's definitely a solid option, though it is one that you sort of need to plan to use pre-game, though I guess you could choose to either activate this one or use hold down deployment depending on what is the most useful to you. So in summary, tank aces are great, they're absolutely worth the 1 command point. For the Rosses, we have 2 decent defensive buffs and 2 decent aggressive buffs, that in general you want to apply to the biggest, nastiest tank commander you have. For the support aces, my favourite is full payload, for damage 3 manticores and basilisks, and for super heavies it's between hold down deployment and steadfast leviathan, depending on exactly what you're facing. I'm looking forward to putting some of these into action in some practice games soon. It's good to have another solid little option with this for the guard, particularly one that you can tailor to your opponent, which is a very powerful ability. Let me know if you've had any experience using these yourself yet, as it'd be good to hear what works and what doesn't. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you've enjoyed the video and would like to see more guard content every couple of days. And if you're looking to buy any Warhammer in the UK in the near future, I do have an Element at Games affiliate link down in the description below. Basically, if you click on that, order something to your door, you get the normal discount for third-party retailers, and Auspex Tactics gets a little bit of the support financially, without it costing you any more. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.